All right, so first class of the night, another air law class. We're reviewing airspace. Should be about 40 minutes. I'm Captain Towers, and we'll get started here. So the teaching points that we're going to go over, we're going to talk about Canadian domestic airspace, airspace definitions, altimeter setting, including the altimeter setting region. We'll talk about control zones, and we'll talk about control area extensions. So hopping right into it. Just for the motivation for the class, as glider pilots in Canada, you'll need to understand the various types of airspace you may encounter. And as pilots, you'll be required by law to follow regulations. So that's why it's important. Okay, so starting out with the Canadian domestic airspace. Canadian domestic airspace is split geographically into the southern domestic airspace and the northern domestic airspace. You can see that for all intents and purposes, any flying that you'll be doing in populated areas is going to be done in the southern domestic airspace. It's only when you get really far north that it starts to become the northern domestic airspace. But those definitions will be important as we get further along here. Airspace definitions and categories. Classifications. There's 7 main airspace categories named A through G. A-class airspace has the most restrictions, while G has the least. The following is taken directly from the CARS with additional diagrams to better explain the differences between the airspace classes. For glider pilots, Transport Canada places a high emphasis on classes B and C. So this is kind of a intro table. There's going to be a few different tables that we're going to look at. The PowerPoints will get posted, so don't worry too much about that. But we'll kind of go through the different classifications and what we do with them. So Canada's airspace, it's split into these 7 classifications. So we've got Class A, we've got B, C, D, E, F, and G. We don't need to know anything related to IFR regulations for the test. We're only concerned about VFR regulations. But here's some additional information about those classes. Okay, so when it comes to VFR, we've already talked about this many times. So the application of any classification to an airspace structure determines the operating rules, the level of ATC, so air traffic control service provided within the structure, and in some instances, communications and equipment regulations. The structure defines the physical dimensions of the elements into which the airspace is divided, such as control zones, terminal control areas, control area extensions, and airways. Okay, there's some speaker notes here. It's the chart. Okay, so for the memorization for the test, this is the chart that you should be referring to because it's specifically for VFR. So it breaks down, here are the 7 main classifications, and then you have how they handle conflict resolution, future traffic information, how they handle separation, the VFR, or the visual minimum clearance, minima, I believe. That's what VMC stands for. Basically, the minimum requirements you need in order to fly VFR in there. Special VFR, whether or not it's allowed, any speed limitations that are present, whether or not you have to have a radio, whether or not you have to have a transponder, and whether or not you have to have a clearance and who would provide that. Any questions about this chart before we move on? Okay. Use another chart or handout that you can use here. So this is a better visual reference, and then this is better if you memorize words and charts better. It's basically the same information. It's just laid out differently. So if we look at these or this chart here, can anyone tell me what the VMC requirements in Class B airspace are? Cameron? Yoon?
Um, 3 statute mile visibility, 1 statute mile horizontal, and 500 vertical from cloud.
500 feet vertical from cloud. Yep, that's correct. And can anyone tell me what you would require to enter Class E airspace? Like what sort of equipment? Cameron again? A transponder? Yep, in designated areas. Okay, what is Class F airspace? Anyone tell me? Restricted airspace? Yep. And it can either be restricted or advisory. So sometimes gliding operations can be Class F advisory airspace. And they could just say, if you're not participating in those operations, you should probably be avoiding flight within the area. And then restricted is you are definitely not authorized to be there without the approval of the user or controlling agency. So example of that might be the training areas for the Moose Jaw base here. So they don't want some farmer in a Cessna putting around while they're trying to fly Harvards around during training. Yeah, or a blast zone. That's another good one. And do you need clearance to enter Class B? Will be the last question that we ask on this. Yes, you do. You must get it from ATC. All right. We talked about this again. This is just another diagram to kind of give a more 3D view of it. If we have extra time, which given that I started a bit late, we probably won't, but I will paste this link in the chat and you guys can watch it on your own. It's made for an American audience, but it gives a breakdown of how airspace looks in 3D using Minecraft. So it's pretty interesting to watch that on your own time there. But go ahead, Cook. What's your question? Those could be examples of that. It would be depend on airport or on maps, basically, as to where the Class F is and what it's being used for. But it could be an aerobatic practice area. It could be an air show. It could be military training area. It could be a lot of different things. Usually they'll tell you. It's just another diagram talking about the airspace around a terminal control area. So you can see that the airport's here, got a control zone here, and you've got a terminal control area, which could be A, B, C, or D. Some class G here, some transition areas, all that sort of stuff. So these are some examples of control zones on a map. It's quite a lot to look at, especially through a screen share. These three are all Ottawa, Montreal, and Quebec, are all part of the control area there. In this slide, you can see the control zone around Ottawa McDonald Cartier Airport labeled as CZC 3000 2600. So let's see if we can find that. There's the airport. So here's that area there, CZC 3000 2600. This is Montreal. You can also see Saint Jean and Saint Hubert in the same image as well. So here's Saint Jean over here, and see if we can't find Saint Hubert as well. Not familiar with this area, so. But anyways, the point is that we've got all these different classifications of airspace, and it's in the real life it's in 3D, but on maps it has to be represented in 2D, so it can be somewhat complicated to decipher from looking at these maps. Okay, and this is Quebec City. So here it should have numerous Class F restricted airspace. So right here, let's see, is this CYR 608? Okay, so CYR 608 is a prison here. And on the northeast edge of the control zone, there's another prison. So CYR right here. On the north of the image, you have various CYR areas for the military airspace for the Valcartier military base as well. So up here. And I don't think I see any other ones over here. But those are just some examples of what that Class F would look like. Here's another diagram or chart for you to refer to for the memorization of what's allowed in the different areas. So Class A, you can't have VFR at all. You have to have IFR. You need a two-way radio. You need a transponder. You need ATC clearance. B, all of those. C, all of those. D, all of those. E, it's all fairly straightforward. But I'll linger on that for a second to allow you to take a screenshot. But again, these will be posted. All right. Let me know in the chat if there's any other questions about the airspace, and we'll get into the altimeter setting and the altimeter setting region. So the altimeter setting region is an airspace of defined dimensions below 18,000 feet above sea level, where the pilot must set the altimeter to the current altimeter setting, and if that is not available, to the elevation of the aerodrome. It has the same boundaries as the southern domestic airspace. Should get. So just for everyone who may or may not know, your altimeter has a little knob on it that you can adjust, and that's your altimeter setting. And it's usually measured in inches of mercury. So when you're in the altimeter setting, the CY, okay, this question here, what does the CY stand for? I believe that's just an indication that it's the Class F airspace, and then it's either going to be R or what was the other one here? A. So it's either going to be CYR or CYA. as far as to what those actual letters stand for. Restricted airspace. Let me take a look. It's been a while. For the altimeter setting. CY is just the prefix used for Canadian aerodromes and airspaces. It just designates Canada as the region. Okay, back to the altimeter setting region. Yeah, so again, like I was saying, the altimeter has a little knob on it. And so when you're in the altimeter setting region, you'll want to set that knob to whatever the altimeter setting is for the closest aerodrome or airport that you're at, so that everybody's at the same sort of basis for what their altimeter is reading. And then when you're in the standard pressure region, so that's all airspace above 18,000 feet and all airspace outside the bounds of the altimeter setting region, you want to set it to the ICAO standard atmosphere reading of 29.92 inches of mercury. It has the same boundaries as northern domestic airspace. So whether or not you're in or at or above 18,000 feet, if you're in the northern domestic airspace, you're also in the altimeter setting region for or you're rather in the standard pressure region. When climbing from the altimeter setting region into the standard pressure region, pilots shall set their altimeters to standard pressure 29.92 inches of mercury or 1013.2 millibars immediately after entering the standard pressure region. And when descending into the altimeter setting region, pilots shall set their altimeters to the appropriate station altimeter setting immediately prior to descending into the altimeter setting region. And here you can see those same boundaries. So up far north is the standard pressure region. Everything below that is just the altimeter setting region. Any questions about that? Just let me know in the chat. Otherwise, we'll get into control zones now. So control zones are defined airspace around an airport extending from the surface to a specified height. The area starts at the surface and usually extends to 3,000 feet AGL with a normal radius of 5 or 7 nautical miles. It's also designated around certain aerodromes to keep IFR aircraft within controlled airspace during approaches and to facilitate the control of VFR and IFR traffic. So that's a control zone. A control area extension is a defined space area near an airport located above the control zone that protects aircraft joining nearby airways. It's usually based at 2,200 feet AGL, so above ground level, unless otherwise specified, and extends up to, but not including, 18,000 above sea level. So, some confirmation questions here. What is required to enter Class B airspace? Cameron, the slides will be posted, so you can refer to those for your notes. I am having to rush this first class a little bit because I was late. I should be able to go a little bit slower on the next classes. Yep. Yeah, I see Yoon there. ATC clearance. Yep, definitely. And we also need that radio and transponder. What's required to enter Class C airspace? Pretty much the same thing here. The one difference with Class B here is that you can also enter with authorization issued by the Minister of Transport. Can anyone tell me what the altimeter setting region is? Yeah, it's the southern domestic airspace and anything below 18,000 feet. So that's kind of defining the area of it. And what do you do within the altimeter setting region? What do you set your altimeter to when you're in the altimeter setting region? You just set it to whatever reading you want. Cook's got it correct. It's the nearest aerodrome, and that'll be based on the weather. Um, let's see. Next question is about the standard pressure region. So, what is the standard pressure region? So, can anyone tell me what it encompasses and what you do with your altimeter when you're in the standard pressure region? Yeah, it's basically all airspace above 18,000 feet and all airspace outside the bounds of the altimeter setting region. Um, and you do set it to the standard reading of 29.92 inches of mercury. So that's correct. Yeah, Dennis has got it pretty much bang on. And we just talked about it, 29.92 inches of mercury, so that's great. And can anyone tell me what what a control zone is? Yeah, exactly. It's a defined area around an airport from surface to a specified height, usually 3,000 feet AGL, with a normal radius of 5 or 7 nautical miles. And can anyone tell me what it's designed to do? Why we have control zones? Prevent accidents. That's a good description. To control IFR. Yep. So it's just designed to keep IFR aircraft within controlled airspace and facilitate the control of VFR and IFR traffic. So that's perfect. Um, that's the end of the slideshow for this lesson. Okay, we will get started here. So once again, I'm Captain Towers. This should take about 40 minutes, and our class today is 401.08, Rules of the Air. We are going to go over right-of-way, dropping of objects, forest fires, flight over built-up areas, formation flying, aerobatics, and VFR cruising altitudes. At the end of the class, you should be familiar with cars pertaining to the rules of the air, right-of-way, altitude restrictions, and aerobatics. And as pilots, you will be required by law to follow the regulations. Being familiar with the rules and regulations is just good airmanship. Also, I have seen pretty much all the content in this class, in this specific class, get tested on before, so it's worth knowing. All right, when it comes to right-of-way, the pilot in command of an aircraft that has the right of way shall, if there is any risk of collision, take such action as is necessary to avoid collision. So basically, this is just saying even if you have the right of way, it's still your responsibility to make sure you're taking any actions necessary to avoid a collision. So it's better to be alive than right. So just make sure that even if you have the right of way, you're remaining vigilant and making sure that you're avoiding collision. Just a tip: remember to think of right of way from the perspective of sitting in the cockpit and who must give way. For example, if you see an aircraft on your left that is at the same altitude as you and heading towards you, who must give way / adjust their heading and yield? Any ideas initially? So we've got you in this aircraft here, and there's an aircraft on your left. It's at the same altitude as you, heading towards you. Well, ultimately, you, but actually in this case, you have the right of way because the aircraft on the right has the right of way. But we'll get into that. I will make a note of this though because it's weird that we asked this right before actually telling you. Note. This is asked before actually talking about the AC on the right. Okay. So another element of right-of-way, where the pilot in command of an aircraft is aware that another aircraft is in an emergency, the pilot in command shall give way to that other aircraft. So emergencies take priority. That's just kind of common sense there. Then this is the relevant thing. When two aircraft are converging at approximately the same altitude, the pilot in command of the aircraft that has the other on its right shall give way except as follows. So here are the kind of priority rules. It basically all just boils down to in thinking of terms of power and maneuverability. So an airship has an engine and can sustain flight regardless of the weather, whereas a glider cannot. So a glider's got higher priority. But a balloon, while it can sustain flight, it can't maneuver like a glider. So a glider should give priority to balloons. So basically, a power-driven, heavier-than-air aircraft shall give way to airships, gliders, and balloons. An airship shall give way to gliders and balloons. A glider shall give way to balloons. And any power-driven aircraft shall give way to aircraft that are seen to be towing gliders or other objects or carrying a slung load. Any questions about that? Usually the questions on the test will give you like a scenario being like, who's got the right of way in this scenario? And as long as you're thinking about, common sense, is one of them having an emergency? Or thinking about it in terms of which aircraft is going to be less inconvenienced to have to give up the right of way versus which aircraft is going to be more inconvenienced to not have the right of way, then you should be pretty set for that. As always, just put questions in the chat whenever you get to them. So this is a lovely GIF here. I'm in one glider here, and we're approaching another glider. So where an aircraft is required to give way to another aircraft, the pilot in command of the first mentioned aircraft shall not pass over or under or cross ahead of the other aircraft unless passing or crossing at such a distance as will not create a risk of collision. So normally the action that you take to get out of the way of another aircraft is you're going to alter your heading to the right. However, in this case, as you're approaching this glider, do you think it would be a good idea for me to turn right to get out of their way? No, it wouldn't be a good idea. And any thoughts as to why it would be a bad idea to turn right, to follow that kind of standard rule of turning to the right to avoid them? So you don't die. Yes, exactly. You don't want to fly over or above them, over or under them, or cross ahead of the other aircraft unless it's not going to create a risk for collision. So obviously, if I'm turning right in this case, that's probably going to create a risk for collision into that aircraft. The Because you're over a body of water. In this case, I'm not actually over a body of water. We're just flying close to a lake. Um, and that doesn't really come into play either. And also, this is also kind of a trick because I'm not actually on a collision course with them. I was actually just flying formation with them. So, but I did like this as just a demonstration of why just turn right to avoid them doesn't always apply. Yeah, so in this case, if I wasn't flying formation with them, I just wanted to avoid them, I'd be making sure that I'm establishing radio contact, letting them know that I'm there because they could turn into me if they don't see me. Maybe applying my spoilers, trying to slow down, turning to the left. I don't necessarily want to jump immediately to turning like full left and circling around because if I lose visual contact with them, I have no idea what they're doing and they could start turning into me and then that would be bad news for everyone involved. So basically, you really shouldn't have let yourself get this close to it in the first place, but when you are in that or if you are ever in that situation, just don't hit the other plane is the key thing. And normally speaking, you would see them much earlier and you would alter your heading to the right to avoid them. Okay, so when two aircraft are approaching head on or approximately so, and there is a risk of collision, the pilot in command of each aircraft shall alter its heading to the right. So no matter what, if you're both going head on, both of you need to turn to the right. So the pilot in command typically sits in the left seat. So you want to alter heading to the right, so you better maintain visual contact with the other aircraft as you turn away. I have flown in one situation where I had a head-on with another aircraft, and that was because when I was doing my training in Saskatoon, ATC cleared me to land on runway, let's see, what would have that have been, 09, and then they cleared a Dash 8 to land on runway 27, which it's the same runway. So I was on final, and then I saw them on final. And I was like, I'm just gonna go do an overshoot to the right. So in that case, they didn't turn to the right; they just proceeded to land. But that's the one anecdote I have about when I was in that situation. Any questions about the head-on rules? Always turn to the right, both pilots. All right. Next one. An aircraft that is being overtaken has the right of way, and the pilot in command of the overtaking aircraft, whether climbing, descending, or in level flight, shall give way to the other aircraft by altering the heading of the overtaking aircraft to the right, and no subsequent change in the relative positions of the two aircraft shall absolve the pilot in command of the overtaking aircraft from this obligation until that aircraft has entirely passed and is clear of the other aircraft. So if you're going to be overtaking an aircraft, you're going to be needing to alter your heading to the right to avoid them. And regardless of what they're doing, it's still your responsibility to make sure you're avoiding them. And as a typically the higher performance aircraft that would be doing the overtaking. So it makes sense that the other aircraft has a right of way. Typically, you're not going to be overtaking, a CF-18 in your Schweitzer 233. Where an aircraft is in flight or maneuvering on the surface, the pilot in command of the aircraft shall give way to an aircraft that is landing or about to land. because most accidents happen in the landing phase of the flight, and aircraft landing thus has priority. Also, it's normally easier and cheaper to delay takeoff for a landing aircraft than it is to have them abort the landing and go around. Again, in my case, where the Cessna was cleared to land and the Dash 8 was cleared to land, obviously I'm just going to do the overshoot because it's going to be a lot cheaper for me to do an overshoot and just go around again rather than making the entire civilian aircraft full of 80 passengers or whatever do an overshoot and go around. But really, that situation shouldn't happen in most cases. A lot of the right of way, I hope you're seeing, is mostly just kind of common sense, hopefully. Next one, the pilot in command of an aircraft that is approaching an aerodrome for the purpose of landing shall give way to any aircraft at a lower altitude that is also approaching the aerodrome for the purpose of landing. And that kind of makes sense too. If they're at a lower altitude, they've got the right of way, they've got the priority to land. The pilot in command of an aircraft at a lower altitude shall not overtake or cut in front of an aircraft at a higher altitude that is in the final stages of an approach to land. So just because you are at a lower altitude doesn't mean it's a good idea to dive in front of somebody else and be like, haha, I've got priority, I'm going to take the runway. No, that's not a good idea when they're in the final stages of an approach to land. No person shall conduct or attempt to conduct a takeoff or landing in an aircraft until there is no apparent risk of collision with any aircraft, person, vessel, vehicle, or structure in the takeoff or landing path. So basically, it's your responsibility as a pilot to make sure that your takeoff or landing path is clear and free of obstructions. The pilot in command is always responsible. Now, when it comes to dropping of objects, the rules are pretty simple. Don't do it. No person shall create a hazard to persons or property on the surface by dropping an aircraft or by dropping an object from an aircraft in flight. Pretty straightforward. Even if it's pretty light, it can get a whole lot of energy picked up. When it comes to forest fires, no person shall operate an aircraft over a forest fire area or over any area that is located within 5 nautical miles of a forest fire area at an altitude of less than 3,000 feet AGL, or in any airspace that is described in a NOTAM issued defining the area of the forest fire. When it comes to flight over built-up areas, an aircraft can be deemed to be operated over a built-up area or over an open-air assembly of persons if the built-up area or open-air assembly of persons is within a horizontal distance of 2,000 feet from an aircraft other than a helicopter or balloon. Except in an airport, heliport, or military aerodrome, no person shall conduct a takeoff, approach, or landing in an aircraft over a built-up area or over an open-air assembly of persons unless that aircraft will be operated at an altitude from which, in the event of an engine failure or any other emergency necessitating an immediate landing, the aircraft can land without creating a hazard to persons or property. So again, kind of common sense. So, altitude restrictions. Flight over built-up areas or open-air assemblies of persons during takeoffs, approaches, and landings. A person can or may conduct a takeoff or landing in an aircraft within a built-up area of a city or town at a place that is not located at an airport, heliport, or a military aerodrome where the place is not set apart for the operation of aircraft. The flight is conducted without creating a hazard to persons or property on the surface. The aircraft is operated for the purpose of a police operation that is conducted in the service of a police authority or for the purpose of saving human life. When it comes to formation flying, no person shall operate an aircraft in formation with other aircraft except by prearrangement between the pilots in command of the aircraft, or where the flight is conducted within a control zone, the pilot in commands and the appropriate air traffic control unit. So You have to make sure you're in communication with the other aircraft. Ideally, you've got it planned out in advance before you even take off. And if you're in a control zone, even that's not good enough to save you. You have to have been in coordination with the air traffic control unit as well. Because from the point of view of ATC, if you're not communicating with them and they suddenly see two aircraft right next to each other, they're going to be freaking out. At least I know I would be if I was an air traffic controller. So again, it's kind of common sense sort of logic when you look at the situation like that. When it comes to aerobatics, no person operating an aircraft shall conduct aerobatic maneuvers over a built-up area or an open-air assembly of persons. When flight visibility is less than 3 miles, anything below 2,000 feet AGL, except in accordance with an issued special flight operations certificate. So the snowbirds would have one of those. In any class of airspace that requires radio contact with air traffic services, unless the appropriate air traffic service unit is advised that aerobatic maneuvers will be conducted. And in Class A, B, C, or D, or ABC airspace or Class D control zone without prior coordination between the pilot and control or the pilot and command and the ATC unit. When it comes to aerobatics with a person or a passenger on board, no person operating an aircraft with a passenger on board shall conduct an aerobatic maneuver unless the pilot in command of the aircraft has engaged in at least 10 hours of dual flight instruction in conducting aerobatic maneuvers, or 20 hours conducting aerobatic maneuvers, and at least 1 hour of conducting aerobatic maneuvers in the preceding 6 months. Now we'll get into cruising altitudes. This is a little bit more of the dry memorization stuff, but still worth paying attention to. So VFR cruising altitudes. The appropriate cruising altitude. So cruising altitude is just the altitude that you should be flying at when you're going long distances. And that appropriate altitude or cruising flight level for an aircraft in level cruising flight is determined in accordance with the magnetic track when you're in the southern domestic airspace and the true track in the northern domestic airspace. The pilot in command of an aircraft shall ensure that the aircraft is operated at a cruising altitude or cruising flight level appropriate to the track that they're flying, unless the pilot in command is assigned another altitude or flight level by an air traffic control unit and the aircraft is operated in level cruising flight at more than 3,000 feet AGL in VFR flight. So the following cruising altitudes apply to flights conducted at 18,000 feet above sea level and below, and above 3,000 feet AGL. So when you are heading west, you should be flying at even 1,000s plus 500 feet. So 4,500, 6,500, 8,500, 10,500, etc. And when you're flying east, you should be flying at odd 1,000s plus 500. So 3,500, 5,500, 7,500, 9,500, etc. The way I usually remembered it when I was a cadet was Easterners are odd, is the little mnemonic that I used to remember it. Because when you're flying east, you're going to be flying the odd 1,000s. The cruising altitudes above 18,000 feet, they're referred to as cruising flight levels and will be abbreviated to the first 3 digits in the tens of thousands. So for example, 25,000 feet would be written as flight level 250. I can tell you that glider is definitely not at any flight level. All right, going to confirmation questions. What distance and height restrictions exist around a forest fire? You can't fly over a forest fire or within 5 nautical miles of a forest fire. Anyone remember the altitude restriction on that? At more than 3,000 feet AGL. Yep, that's correct. And in any airspace that is described as a note in a NOTAM issued defining the area of the forest fire. Perfect. You are the pilot of an aircraft and are flying 1,500 feet horizontally from a city. According to the cars, are you over the built-up area? Yes, you are. And that's because you're within a horizontal distance of 2,000 feet. Who must prearrange formation flying? You might catch a wicked thermal above a forest fire, but you'll also probably catch lung cancer and poor visibility and death. So, probably don't. The pilot in command of the aircraft must arrange it with the other pilots that are flying and the ATC if relevant. So, thanks for that, Cameron. My blue light filter is turning on, so let me just see if I can save that again. There we go. Okay, and then let me just bump back to here to move some speaker notes that are on the wrong slide. There we go. Okay. You are flying VFR on a track of 190 degrees magnetic. What cruising altitudes can you use? So with a track of 190 degrees magnetic, are you flying west or are you flying east? Exactly. We're flying west, so it's 4,500, 6,500, 8,500. So those even thousands plus 500. And if you were flying east, so if let's say we were flying 170 degrees magnetic, odd thousands plus 500 feet. If you see an aircraft approaching from your right, who must alter their heading? You. That is correct. Who has priority? An aircraft taking off or landing? That's correct. Another fun story, also from Saskatoon when I was doing my course. I was once on final for the runway, and I was actually holding up the snowbirds from taking off because they were waiting for me to land before they could take off and go to their next stop. So, even though I was in but a lowly Cessna, I had priority. Uh, okay. When two aircraft are approaching head on, what shall they do? Both turn right. Both alter their headings to the right. That's correct. Who has the right of way for landing, a higher or a lower aircraft? The lower aircraft, that's correct. When overtaking an aircraft, who has the right of way? The slow one. Yeah, the aircraft being overtaken has the right of way. Perfect. So that was the end of the class there. So once again, Captain Towers, 401.09, aircraft maintenance, aviation occurrences, and flight plans and itineraries. So we're going to talk about the important aspects of aircraft maintenance, some types of aviation occurrences. We'll cover flight plans and itineraries, including when to file them and how to close them. At the end of the class, you should be able to describe different requirements related to aircraft maintenance, identify and describe aviation occurrences, and describe flight plans and itineraries. Identify when to file them and how to close them. So the teaching points that we're going to go through, we're going to talk about aircraft maintenance, maintenance release and elementary work, maintenance schedules, aviation occurrences, flight plans and itineraries, and arrival reports. So jumping right into aircraft maintenance, it's against the civil aviation regulations, the law, to fly an airplane that is not maintained as per its airworthiness limitations. It's against the cars to fly when an aircraft has undergone maintenance, unless the maintenance has been certified and signed off in the aircraft documents. So any exceptions to this is any crew required for a maintenance test flight. So no passengers or students should be on board for a maintenance test flight. Any official observers, so flight engineers, could be authorized. And the pilot must enter in the log that the test flight was completed before the aircraft returns to service. The mechanics in this picture here are performing a 100-hour inspection on a glider, and that glider was at an airfield where there was no hangar facilities available, so the inspection was done outdoors, which sometimes happens in the Air Cadet Flying Program. All right, so maintenance release and elementary work. So the maintenance release was what we were talking about here. It was required to be signed off in the documents. But when it comes to elementary work, there's no maintenance release required for any tasks that are identified as elementary work. So some examples of elementary work include fabric patches measuring not more than 15 centimeters, so 6 inches, removal and replacement of tires, wheels, or skid shoes, not requiring any removal of any hydraulic lines. When you have removal and replacement of glider wings and tail surfaces that are designed for quick assembly, removal and replacement of aircraft batteries, removal and replacement of co-pilot control levels and levers and pedals that are designed for rapid removal and replacement. Those are all considered elementary work and don't require a maintenance release. So all aircraft shall have an approved maintenance program. So for example, in our program, we have the Schweitzer 233 glider, which has a 100-hour inspection that's required and an annual inspection. We also have the L-19 or Superdog tow plane, which has a 50-hour inspection, a 100-hour inspection, an annual inspection, and a 2,000-hour engine overhaul. We also have the Blanca Scout, especially in Northwest and Central, and they also have a 50 and 100-hour inspection. I'm uncertain about the annual inspection and the hours specific to the engine overhaul, but we do also have a separate maintenance program for them. The airplane in this image is missing its engine and propeller. The engine had flown for 2,000 hours and was due for an overhaul. So it was removed from the airframe, packed in a special crate, and shipped to a special maintenance facility. Once overhauled, the engine and propeller were reinstalled. Aviation occurrences. So an aviation occurrence includes any accident or incident associated with the operation of aircraft, and any situation or condition that the board, so the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, has reasonable grounds to believe could, if left unattended, induce an accident or incident. So an occurrence is going to be an accident, an incident, or any situation or condition which could have led to an accident or incident. So this glider was not secured properly and it blew away in a storm. Even though there were no people on board, that's still going to be an incident, I believe. So a reportable aviation accident, an accident resulting directly from the operation of an aircraft, where a person sustains a serious injury or is killed as a result of being on board the aircraft, coming into contact with any part of the aircraft or its contents, or being directly exposed to the jet blast or rotor downwash of the aircraft. An aviation accident is also if the aircraft is missing or inaccessible, or if the aircraft sustains damage or failure that adversely affects the structural strength, performance, or flight characteristics of the aircraft, and that requires major repair or replacement of any affected component part. So I am not an aircraft maintenance engineer, but I can look at that glider and tell you that's going to need some major repair. So is it going to be an incident or is it going to be an accident? An accident, that's correct. So a reportable aviation incident is an aviation occurrence which is not considered an accident, however still affects or has the potential to affect the safety of the operation. Examples include an engine fails or is shut down as a precautionary measure, smoke or fire occurs, a fuel shortage occurs that necessitates a diversion or requires approach and landing priority at the destination of the aircraft, or a risk of collision or a loss of separation occurs. So that example that I provided of the head-on on final could have been considered a aviation incident. Flight plans and flight itineraries. So CAR 60273 states that no pilot in command shall operate an aircraft in VFR flight unless a flight plan or flight itinerary has been filed, unless the flight is being conducted within 25 nautical miles of the point of departure. So does anybody know if we typically file flight plans or flight itineraries for our gliders going up and down doing FAM flights for the cadets? Anyone feel like filing 40 flight plans in a day? No, we don't, because we stay within that 25 nautical miles of the point of departure. Regardless of the distance the aircraft will travel from the point of departure, a flight plan is required for flights that leave Canada to enter another country. A flight itinerary is not acceptable for this purpose. So even if you have an airport right on the border of the US and it's less than 25 nautical miles to get to the other side, you still need to file a flight plan for that. So the main differences between flight plans and itineraries: a flight plan shall be filed with an ATC unit, a flight service station, or a community aerodrome radio station, and unless a search and rescue time was specified when the flight plan was filed, search and rescue will begin 1 hour after the last reported estimated time of arrival. A flight itinerary is less formal than a flight plan. It shall be filed with a responsible person or an ATC unit, a flight service station, or a community aerodrome radio station. Unless otherwise specified when the flight itinerary was filed, search and rescue will begin 24 hours after the. Let me just. The typos stick out to me. There we go. 24 hours after the last reported ETA, estimated time of arrival. So a responsible person is any individual who has agreed with the person who has filed the flight. There's a lot of typos on this. Who has filed the flight itinerary to ensure that if the aircraft is overdue, the following are notified in an appropriate manner. So they agree to notify an ATC unit, an FSS, so flight service station, or CARS, or rescue coordination center. So basically, they've agreed to watch for you to arrive, and if you don't arrive, file or contact the appropriate authorities to look for you. All right, arrival reports. As soon as possible after landing, an arrival report shall be filed with a responsible person, an ATC unit, a flight service station, or a community aerodrome radio station, as appropriate. When an arrival report is filed, the flight plan or flight itinerary will be closed and will terminate all alerting services with respect to the search and rescue notification. If a flight plan has been filed, an arrival report must be made as soon as practical after landing, but not later than 1 hour after the last reported ETA. And if a flight itinerary was used for the flight, the arrival report must be made no later than 24 hours after the last reported ETA. So basically, you know the deadlines for when they'll start sending search and rescue. It's your responsibility to make sure you're filing that flight report as soon as possible, but definitely no later than what would have triggered those search and rescue responses. So arrival reports, they're pretty straightforward. It just has to include the aircraft registration mark, flight number, or radio call sign, so just your identification for the aircraft and the flight, essentially. The type of flight plan, so whether it was IFR or VFR, or whether it was a flight itinerary. The airport or the aerodrome that you left from, so the departure aerodrome, the arrival aerodrome, and the date and time of arrival. All right, so into the confirmation questions for this class. Can anyone provide me an example of a maintenance program, specifically within the Air Cadet Flying Program? "50-hour inspection," and what aircraft is this for? Can anyone tell me the maintenance program that we have for the gliders? Okay, so for the Air Cadet Gliding Program gliders, the maintenance program that we have is a 100-hour inspection and an annual inspection. And then for the L19 Superdog, we have a 50-hour inspection, a 100-hour inspection, and an annual inspection, as well as a 2,000 hours engine overhaul. But basically, every plane that's flown should have a maintenance program, and that maintenance program should be followed. Otherwise, it's no longer certified airworthy, and you can't fly it. What are some examples of elementary work that we went over? Elementary work is the kind of maintenance items that wouldn't trigger you having to get it signed off in the logs. Fabric patches less than 15 centimeters. Changing tires, as long as it doesn't require any removal of hydraulic lines. Yep, the replacement of wheels that don't need the removal of hydraulic lines. Battery replacement. And removal and replacement of co-pilot control levers and pedals that are designed for rapid removal and replacement. And the final one there was removal and replacement of glider wings and tail surfaces that are designed for quick assembly. If an aircraft is missing, is it an accident or an incident? An accident, that is correct. True or false, a flight plan can be filed with a responsible person. False, that's correct. Only a flight itinerary can be filed with a responsible person. How long will it take for search and rescue to start searching for you if you file a flight plan or a flight itinerary? Sprout, is that for a flight plan or for a flight itinerary? Correct. So 24 hours after the last ETA for your flight itineraries. And then for flight plans, it's 1 hour. Okay, so that was a pretty straightforward lesson. So, Human Performance in Military Aviation, HPMA, 408.04 Intro to Communication is the class that we'll be going through now. So we're going to talk about human performance in military aviation. We'll talk about some communication basics. We'll talk about some barriers to communication and 5 essential skills when it comes to communicating. So human performance in military aviation. Historically, aviation education has focused more on hard skills, so the theoretical knowledge, so your air law, theory of flight, meteorology, and the ability to move the controls of the aircraft correctly and proficiently. What we're trying to do with HPMA is create a framework for teaching the soft skills required to be a good pilot, and therefore increasing our operational effectiveness. HPMA is seeking to provide knowledge to create a common framework of understanding, and will teach the skills as part of initial training and evaluate them to help pilots improve their skills. So HPMA covers communication, task and workload management, hazard, threat, error management, decision making, rules, regulations, and SOPs, standard operating procedures, individual factors, team performance, automation. Not all of these subjects are going to be covered as part of the National Ground School program, or even will be covered on the glider pilot training course. But it's important to get just a brief overview of them. There's not going to be a lot of testing on this specific class, as far as I'm aware. I could always be wrong, but this is sort of just really good general information and soft skills for you to know as a pilot and just for just existing in general. So it's worth listening to and participating in if you can. So, how do you define communication? As pilots, we communicate all the time to others, whether taxiing on the ground, joining the circuit, communicating issues to others, or just announcing our intentions. Communicating clearly is a critical skill to being a good pilot. You can't just be old Farmer Joe in your aircraft buzzing the tower without a radio. Like, you got to communicate with all the other people in the air and on the ground. So communication is defined as the process of exchanging ideas through a common system of verbal and nonverbal signals. A definition is pretty straightforward, but it comes up a little short of the ideal. We are more concerned in aviation about effective communication. So, effective communication is being able to communicate your thoughts and feelings in such a way that the other person shares the same meaning that you do. The concept of effective communication goes one step beyond the first definition. You really want to ensure that the other person has understood what you said, not just heard it. After all, you can communicate all you want, but it's not going to be effective unless all parties involved share the same meaning and understanding of what you just said as you do. All right? Again, with this, feel free to jump in, ask questions at any point. I'll be happy to address them. So consider the following example. I never said your dog was ugly. How many different meanings could this have? Can anyone provide some different interpretations of this one sentence? What might be meant by this sentence? I never said your dog was ugly. That's perfect. Great first one. I never said your dog was ugly. It was said, but not by me. What's another interpretation? So the meaning of this sentence can change based on nonverbal cues. Yep, there's also I never said your dog was ugly. So it wasn't ever said. He never said, just thought the dog was ugly. So I never said your dog was ugly. Um, I never said your dog was ugly. So that's another one. So I was talking about someone else's dog. And then finally we have I never said your dog was ugly. So I said it was something else. The way we say it has a lot to do with how it will be understood, and we have to watch out for communications that could be misinterpreted based on the literal meaning of the words. While this is somewhat of a contrived and silly example, it does highlight one important point. Communication goes much deeper than our words. Everything we do communicates something to the people around us. So in this lesson, you're going to see that effective communication is much more than one person's responsibility to understand. All parties to communications share responsibility for the communication process. So, communication basics. Here's a secret to good communication. Humans have different senses. For communication, we have 2 ears, 2 eyes, 1 mouth. It's important that we use them in that order and proportion. So communication includes a lot of nonverbal signs, and unfortunately, in aviation, you're not always going to be able to see the people you are communicating with. So when you can pay attention to the nonverbal cues, do so. But it's also important to recognize that the people on the other end aren't going to be receiving those cues. So you have to be extra clear in your communication. So some stats on modes of communication. It's found that about 7% of communication is received through verbal, and then 38% of the meaning of a communication is through tone and volume, but then 55% of it can be, or as much as 55% can come from the body language. Now, if you look at those stats, what do you think happens when you're working at a noisy aerodrome with engines running, where you're focused on a specific task, etc.? Any ideas? You think there's any potential for problems there? Things can get confused. Yep, they can get misinterpreted. They can get misheard. All sorts of issues. So in those environments, it becomes difficult to communicate effectively because we may be losing out on one or more of the modes of communication. So body language, etc. If we can't see each other, so if we're talking over the radio or we're really far away, then we're simply relying on our words and the way we say them. The face-to-face component contributes a great deal to the overall communication process. This is why it's so important to brief ahead of time. And we need to establish protocols that will be followed. Standard terminology is also another excellent way of maximizing the effectiveness of the communication process. So these are some of the different strategies we employ to kind of deal with these problems. Another thing that we were talking about in a previous class is marshalling signals. So that is a good example of standardized communication using signs. A key point to all of this is we want to talk about threat and error management. We're trying to avoid or trap communication errors through those standard operating procedures, the standardized hand signals and callouts, etc. So if we think about our stop, stop, stop signal, anyone that hears those words knows exactly how to respond. Likewise, if someone can't hear what you're saying but can see both of your arms raised up, again, they know how to respond. So for more efficient communications, we should be careful about how we say things because it's often more important than what is said. And we also need to understand it is primarily the responsibility of the sender to ensure that the message is correctly understood. So the tone, body language, and the words we emphasize can completely change the way that the message is interpreted. The same words can be perceived as urgent to apply now or as ironic and therefore worthless simply by changing the way we pronounce them and our body language. Since in aviation, you as a pilot, you're using a radio, contextual elements other than words are more difficult to communicate. So there's a clear advantage to using standardized terminology and not just making it up so that we can reduce those confusions. So this is a very animation heavy slide for most of the stuff I do, but we'll go through this. In the previous section, we stressed the importance of communication and how it can help enhance performance. While there's a lot happening in the communication process, overall it's a simple system. It consists of several small elements that can positively or negatively affect the quality of the communication. The process might seem complicated based on this diagram here, but a little practice will improve your communication skills. So the communication process is influenced by both internal and external barriers. And we'll get into that in the next slide, but first we'll go through a little bit of a scenario here. So internal barriers are being represented by the world behind the head, and external barriers are being represented by this brick wall in the middle here. So the communication process itself begins with the sender forming an idea based on their perception of the situation and their mental models. So their internalization of the world around them, that's how they're forming their communication. They're now sending it to the receiver. As the message reaches its destination, the receiver will hopefully perceive the message correctly. They're going to be comparing the message that they receive to their own mental models and form their own understanding of the communications. So if the sender is this battleship here and the receiver is a sailboat, they both have a nautical background, but they might have some different mental models and different expectations of each other if they don't fully understand where each other are coming from. How do we know that the message has been understood? So when you send something out there, how do you confirm that somebody has understood what you communicated to them? So this is something you probably encounter at the local squadrons a lot, say when you're giving like leadership taskings or if you're instructing a class or something. How can you confirm that the people you're communicating with have received and understood your message? Any thoughts? Confirmation, sure, but what does that look like? Asking questions about the lesson to the cadets? Yep. So you're looking for feedback on that communication that you sent out into the world. Without that feedback, the sender is never going to know if the receiver understood. If you receive that feedback that the message has been understood, then your mission is complete. If the feedback you receive indicates that the message has not been understood, you have to restart the process again and send it again. Figure out another way of stating it. Um, when it comes to the feedback that you receive, would we consider yeah, whatever, nope? Is that effective feedback? Yes, great. That's kind of hit on what I'm getting at is that we want to make sure that we're asking effective questions and getting effective feedback. So, do you understand is not an effective question, whereas asking them to restate their tasking or understanding of what you communicated to them in their own words is effective feedback. So, she said that ask them to repeat it back to make sure that they know, and that's how you can get effective feedback. I don't know how many of you have instructed classes before, but usually, if you ask the confirmation question of, does everyone understand? I don't think I've ever, in my entire cadet career, my entire officer career, ever had somebody actually just go and say no. They all just kind of give blank nods and go, yep, sure, when a lot of times they perhaps didn't understand. And so that's why it's important to get effective feedback and to ask the right questions. Okay. So feedback is the most important part of the communication process. It allows us to break through those barriers in the communication process. So it's not sending the message, it's not receiving the message that's the most important. It's making sure that the sender can verify that the receiver understood what was sent. What are some possible barriers to communication? We're going to talk about internal barriers and external barriers. So, can you guys come up and brainstorm with some ideas of barriers that you can think of to communication? What sort of issues come up that cause problems in communication that you can think of off the top of your head or that you've got past experience with? Physical distance, for sure. Not being able to see the person you're talking to. Rudenko,
The accent.
pardon, can you say that again? Sorry.
The accent. The person speaks different language, they have a different accent.
For sure, the accent, 100%. Language, accents, grammar. Yep. Stuttering. Going off of just, how they vocalize the message. What are some other barriers that you can think of? Static, so noise. Yeah. Hearing or sight impairments. Vocabulary. Yep. If they're using big words. If the emotional state of both the sender and the receiver. Poor Wi-Fi. Yeah. Connection issues. Multitasking, distractions. Yep. These are some good ones. Okay, so we kind of break it down on this slide into internal and external. So we talked about a fair few of them. So yep, boredom. If they're bored, they're disengaged, they're not paying attention. That's definitely a barrier to communication. I know I get distracted easily, and if I'm distracted, then I'm probably not taking in what's being said, and I'm not communicating effective. So under the heading of internal barriers, so these are kind of like mental barriers or barriers uh, internal to the people. But you've got attitudes, ego. Maybe they don't think it's worth their time listening to you. Boredom, mental distractions. So they got other issues going on at home or at work, whatever. Your physical health, your emotions. Maybe you have poor credibility, or they don't believe that the person that they're talking to has good credibility. Perhaps they have poor listening skills, so they're more interested in thinking about what they're going to say next rather than listening to what's actually being said. A lack of experience, that could be an internal barrier. They just don't understand the process, what's going on. Don't have experience in the world. Um, Different knowledge, yep, different baselines where you're coming from. Some examples of the external barriers. We have different crew positions, ranks. You can have workload, fatigue, stress, Language and culture, we talked about that. Complexity of the item being talked about also ties into vocabulary a little bit. Physical environment that you're operating within, so temperature, humidity, the not being able to see the nonverbal cues and distractions in the environment, more environmental barriers like noise, visibility. Um, Overall, barriers disrupt the communication process, and we overcome barriers with feedback. So, all of this can seem like a lot to get in the way of being an effective communicator and having your message communicated effectively. And the way that we solve that is with feedback. Okay, before communicating a message, the sender should think before you speak. Whenever possible, try to use standardized formats and phraseology. Avoid unnecessary emotions when speaking. Be aware of nonverbals, such as your tone of voice, and be consistent. Reconfirm when you are unsure and be open to feedback. Excuse me. And always listen carefully when communicating with others. And in the previous section, we highlighted the importance of communication and some of the factors that can influence it. Since the sender controls how they communicate, they should try as hard as possible to prepare their messages well, and some simple ideas can help make their communication more effective. Here are some of them that we just talked about here. Although there may be many events in the communication process, the process itself can be considered a simple system. In fact, the communication process is made up of several small elements that can positively or negatively affect the quality of communication. So moving on from that, we're going to dive into the 5 essential skills of communication. So we have inquiry, advocacy, assertion, active listening, conflict resolution, and critique/feedback. We'll dive into all of this here, but we've already seen that the communication process can be a complicated circuit that involves many different elements. To communicate effectively, you need to understand the essential skills that will assist in that process. There's been a ton of different research that's been done in the field of communication, and in the analysis of effective communication in a team environment, these 5 essential skills have been identified. So we talked about inquiry, advocacy, assertion, active listening, conflict resolution, and critique and feedback. These are the 5 sort of essential skills of communication. So starting off with inquiry, it's primarily aimed at increasing your own awareness. You want to actively seek information by asking clear and concise questions. You want to relate your concerns accurately. You want to keep an open mind. You want to draw conclusions from valid information and always ask for feedback. So that's the first essential skill, inquiry. Next up, advocacy/assertion. So to prevent conflict, you should follow these simple guidelines when it comes to advocating for your position. You want to clearly state your position. Keep the focus on what's right, not who's right. Give facts, not vague questions. You want to suggest solutions. If you feel the need to advocate for your position, try to have a solution ready to offer. Let me just update the speaker notes here. To offer. And this will help you be part of the solution and not part of the problem. So I see this a lot in the cadet program and other places where it's easy for people in general to identify that there's a problem and complain about the problem. And, it can be sometimes fun to complain and commiserate about a problem with other people. But if you want to be an effective communicator and effective in general, like, you want to figure out how to help solve that problem. Don't just come up with what the problem is, but also come up with some ideas of how to potentially solve that problem and suggest those as solutions. You want to be persistent and timely. If you see something out of the ordinary, speak up. The longer you keep information to yourself, the harder it gets to speak up. So I'm sure if you've taken some instructional techniques classes, you've learned about the importance of providing feedback to your students or cadets, or perhaps if you're doing leadership development, all that sort of stuff, you want to provide timely feedback, right? If you wait like days, weeks, months, years to address something, then it's not going to be as effective. You want to make sure you're always listening carefully and that you're keeping an open mind. So when you're advocating, you need to remember that you're presenting your perception of the situation. It's entirely possible that you don't have an accurate picture of that situation, and maybe the other person that you're talking to has some important information that would address your concern. So don't just fly off the handle and assume that the other person's out to get you, or they don't know what they're doing, or anything like that. Approach it with an open mind, with the potential or with the understanding that, okay, maybe I don't have all the information. You just want to approach it with the attitude that this is based on my information and where I'm coming from. This is what I see. Advocacy. Yeah. Okay. When to be assertive. When do you think it's appropriate to be assertive, and what personal guidelines do you follow? So there are some times when it's essential that we are assertive. So when you're unsure of events, whenever something is going on around you that you are unsure of, ask questions. There are many past accidents and or incidents when someone felt uneasy about the situation but never said anything. So this is one of the things I really like to stress with the staff cadets when they show up for the first time at the Moose Jaw Cadet Flying Site is I view them as like one of our most valuable team members when they're brand new to the operation. And I strongly encourage them to always speak up and ask questions when they see something that they don't fully understand what's going on, because that's an opportunity for us to learn and solve these issues. And it's quite possibly that it's an actual issue that needs to be solved. So whenever you're unsure of the events happening around you, don't just go with the flow. Like, stop, make sure you ask the questions, figure out what's going on. There's thousands of accidents and incidents in the past that have the people in the in that environment have had like a gut feeling that something's not quite right, but they haven't bothered to speak up and ask that question. So when you're unsure of events, be assertive. When you have the answer, provide the information. When asked, state your point clearly. If you're not asked, provide feedback to the other crew members in a manner that makes the point clear. So if you see a problem and you know the solution to that problem, speak up, make your voice heard. If you perceive immediate danger or any potential for danger, if you detect a problem, say something. There is no one person that's perfect in the world that can see all of the problems. It's always important to bring those potential issues up. Don't just rely on somebody else having maybe seen it. And you can help rebuild your own or someone else's situational awareness through inquiry or advocacy, depending on the situation. The key point from this slide, though, is don't sit idle while something bad happens while completing a task. Aviation can be unforgiving and requires the entire team's commitment. So how to be assertive? So being assertive without appearing aggressive can be difficult for some people. This slide is trying to show you one method of being assertive and that can potentially help conflict or prevent conflict. Putting it all together, here I'll just list all of those. So we want to have an opening where we say their name, we get their attention, time out. We want to state the concern. I am uncomfortable. We want to state the problem, real or perceived. We want to offer a solution. I think we should, and then we should try to obtain agreement. What do you think? So for that, if we put that all together, we could say, hey, Flight Sergeant Bloggins, time out. I'm really worried about pushing this glider into the hangar with just the two of us. We can't see everything, and we might bump into one of the other airplanes or equipment inside. I think that we should wait for or get more people to help and watch the other wing and tail. What do you think? So you want to start by creating that opening. Whatever you have to do to get the person's attention, call them by their name, say something like time out, anything to get their undivided attention. You want to state the concern. You want to use the I statements here. Express your specific concern. Don't be vague. A good tip is to use I when stating a concern to prevent people from being defensive. You want to try and focus the attention on you. You are the one with the problem. I'm getting a bad feeling about this. You don't want to say, um, you know, you're telling us to keep going into the hangar when we shouldn't. That's a bad idea. Like, they're going to go on the defensive. Focus on, I'm feeling this way, and this is why we should deal with this problem. You want to offer the solution. People don't like problems. They like solutions. Once again, use I if possible when suggesting something. Who else do we need to include in the solution? Why? Then offer it to the group using we or us. It shifts the focus back to the entire team. Hey guys, I think that getting a couple more people on struts would make it easier for us to do this. And then the last step is to obtain agreement, to get action. So if this doesn't work, then what? How far do you go? Then things are serious. At least someone's perception of the situation is serious. You may have to use something else to jog the crew or other team members into awareness of potential risks of a bad decision chain. Often a simple lighthearted comment makes the same point. Hey, I don't want to become a case study. We should think about this. I don't want to have the next flight safety report to be read out to the rest of the region. Let's take a moment. If that doesn't work, you might have to resort to more drastic measures. If you say something like, this is stupid, you'll probably make people really think about their choice, but it might also have a negative effect of creating conflict. You'd be better off to say something like, I really don't like this. Depending on the severity of the situation, you'll have to weigh your alternatives. Is it worth it? However, if you've done all this, you've made your case, and the leader insists on going ahead, you should make it clear that, okay, I'm not comfortable with this, but I'm going to do my best. Just so you know, I'll be mentioning this with the boss. While the use of the assertive statement was intended for a team environment, it's an equally effective way of making you think about your own actions. A lot of cases of damage to equipment and injury to personnel are avoided by an individual who took a second to say, what am I doing? This is crazy. Think of these techniques as your own conscience. If you're not comfortable with the situation, maybe your priorities need to be revisited. So active listening, that's the third one here. When it comes to active listening, we all like to be heard and understood. The problem is that many people are simply not good listeners. That's because they consider listening to be a passive function. After all, you sit there, do nothing, and just listen, right? Wrong. Active listening requires a genuine desire to understand the message and all of its hidden cues. It involves actively seeking to understand what is being said. So that means focusing on the individual, cutting down on distractions, and allowing the other person to finish what they are saying before you add your input. It also means more than just attending to the actual words, but the entire communication process, verbal, nonverbal, body language signals, listening and expressing what the other person has said. I know I've definitely been guilty of it in the past where I'm having a conversation with someone and they start talking, and instead of actively listening to them, I'm just thinking about what I'm going to be saying for my next response. And that's not an effective way to communicate. You might as well just be two monkeys yelling at a wall. So active listening means that you show the other person that you have understood the communication. You're not making assumptions. You're being sensitive to their thoughts and feelings. Effective listeners must listen for any of those feelings in the communication process. So here's a little exercise that we're going to do. The following is a list of related words, and I'm going to read them off. And then I want you to write down as many of the words as possible after I say them out. And then I'll ask you how many you got. Okay? Is everybody ready? Let's see a thumbs up if you're ready to start writing. Still missing a few. All right. Well, I'll be going medium fast just to prove the point of this exercise. All right, starting now. Bed, sheet, relax, snooze, blanket, quiet, pillow, drowse, alarm, warm, mattress, night, pajamas, bedroom, doze, nap. I'll give you 30 seconds to finish writing, and then I'll ask some questions. This is a class that was developed for an in-person session, so it's a little bit hard to do when you can just write in the chat, or as the instructor, you're supposed to be able to see them writing. But this is one of the exercises that we'd like to change. But anyways, how many people got 8 or less? How many people got the word bed? Let's see, just thumbs up as reactions. Okay. How many got nap? Okay. How many got sleep? Ha ha ha! You have triggered the trap card. I never said the word sleep. So this is just a little exercise to illustrate how the mind can add words we never heard if we aren't very careful. So some key points. We want to tie the learning experience to the real world. Even though we're focused, actively listening on a very small amount of info, 16 words, some of the info was missed, and also some of us discovered words that were not mentioned. How could not getting all the information be a factor on the airfield? Has anyone got a personal experience or anecdote that they want to share related to this? Any time from your experience in the cadet program where somebody, whether it was you or Cadet Bloggins, didn't get all the information, led to some hijinks? No one? Everyone's getting tired? All right. So active listening. How do we listen? What are some of the things that we can do to help listen actively? We can cut down on distractions. You can face the speaker, look relaxed. That shows them that you're ready to listen and puts them at ease. Want to maintain eye contact. Encourage the other person to speak, which shows interest in the speaker and what they have to say. Don't prepare your response while listening. This is something I've been guilty of many times before, but you can't do it. You can't listen and prepare your response at the same time. You need to actively listen to it, take a moment to process what they said, and then prepare your response. You don't want to finish the speaker's sentence. You want to let them finish talking. You want to control your emotions, be patient, ask questions. Some of the different types of questions are closed questions. They're pointed questions, useful in getting specific information quickly, but you have to be careful because sometimes they might feel like they're being interrogated. So some closed questions might be, how many technicians are required? How long will you be flying? or you want to fly over that hill. Open-ended questions for long answers, which allows freedom of response, useful for identifying attitudes and beliefs, but it can be time-consuming. So what do you think about that technician's technique? What other areas would you like to draw our attention to? What do you think we should do? Probing questions, when you would like the person to clarify or elaborate. So how did you know what to look for? I see. Any idea why that happened? You want to paraphrase. So putting the other person's ideas or feelings into your own words. That provides that feedback to them. It's the dual purpose of assuring comprehension of the message and also serves as feedback to the center or to the sender. So an example would be, so if I understand correctly, you've outlined two problems. The skid plate is worn very thin and the pitot tube appears to have dirt in it. And stop talking. You can't listen if you're talking. Okay, the last skill, or it's missing one, but conflict resolution. So is conflict a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Not all conflict is bad. In fact, the presence of occasional conflict, that means that personnel are concerned about the operation. If they weren't, they wouldn't bother to raise the issue. So most people automatically think of conflict as yelling or screaming match. That's rarely the case. It's usually subtle and hard to spot from the outside. For example, two people being excessively polite to each other because they really can't stand each other and neither wants to induce a confrontation. That's conflict. Conflict occurs when the team is not working towards common goals. So the most important point to focus on is what is right, not who is right. This helps to reduce the emotional factor in a conflict. It should be us against the problem, not us against each other. Whoa, slide too fast. Okay. When it comes to deciding what to do with the conflict, you want to consider the question, does the conflict adversely affect the mission? If no, handle it on the ground. If yes, resolve the conflict. So some strategies for managing conflict. You want to maintain control. If possible, you can suggest dealing with the issue after a short cooling down period, which can prevent one of the participants from reacting solely based on emotion. Avoid sharing the anger. Don't allow your concern for the issue to influence other people. This doesn't stop you from discussing it with other people, but use caution because you might not be justified in your concern. You want to make sure you're listening, so use the active listening skills that we talked about. You want to use open-ended questions, probing questions, paraphrasing. We want to seek first to understand before being understood. Allow the other person to explain. Use a problem-sharing approach. Clarify the problem. Explore ways to resolve it. We have a problem. Define the problem. Explore alternatives and consequences. You want to maintain respect. Avoid personal insults and put-downs. Separate the facts from opinion. Mentally separate the facts from irate expressions. You want to avoid hasty responses. Allow time for issues, facts versus opinions, to settle. This may mean going back to the issue a little later. Make your decisions based on facts, not emotions. And you want to seek constructive solutions. So explore the various alternatives. Try to incorporate the other person's idea into the solution. It's hard to be in conflict with someone when you're going along with their idea, even if it's only partially their idea. At this stage, you're trying to achieve some form of ownership in the situation. You want to keep everyone involved and in agreement. So finally, we get to critique and feedback. So we talked about feedback a lot in this, but it's our way of closing the loop and monitoring progress for helping improve performance in yourself and others. It's the only way to know if our perceptions, goals, or mental models are aligned. Unfortunately, it's quite often overlooked. Don't assume that your message was understood unless you have some type of positive feedback. Don't accept those one-word answers. Sure, yeah, whatever, okay, I understand. That's not good enough. In a study of National Transportation Safety Board accidents in the U.S., lack of monitoring and feedback were attributed to 22% of all airline accidents. A less experienced individual will be able to learn through the use of effective feedback on their performance. So, some general guidelines to follow in terms of providing feedback. Be descriptive. Focus on observable behaviors, not attitudes, feelings, personality, etc. Describe the impact of the behavior on others in the working environment. Focus on sharing of ideas and information rather than giving advice. You want to be timely and considerate. So give feedback as soon as possible, but make sure there's time to fully discuss the issues. So it's got to be timely feedback, but it also needs to be enough time to actually discuss the issues. So as a quick example, there was a parade that I went to on Sunday, and there were some cadets that made some comments there, and I need to give them some feedback on some of the conversations that they were having and address that issue. But I couldn't directly on Sunday because I didn't have enough time to actually have that conversation in full with them. So now I'm going to have to wait for our next parade night. So would it have been better to give the timely feedback then and there? Yes, but I also needed enough time to make sure that we were having the full proper discussion about the issue. Avoid asking questions for which you already know the answer. Avoid interrupting the other person. Let them communicate their thoughts and give feedback in private. So you can give positive feedback in public and give people kudos. But if you're giving, kind of negative feedback or feedback that is kind of like, well, you weren't really doing this quite right, then you should try and do that in private whenever possible. You want to balance positive and constructive feedback. Add the word because to your feedback. It forces you to give the reason why. So that was a good landing because you flew the approach well. So that helps give them more actionable insight when you're providing them negative feedback, but also it helps validate and give authority and context to the positive feedback that you're giving. If you can give the specifics of why they're doing a good job, not just good job, because that gets kind of empty after a while, right? You want to use I statements to take responsibility for what you're saying. It clarifies to the receiver that you are presenting the feedback as you see it. You want to verify understanding and agreement. You want to ask the receiver to paraphrase what you have just said and get their feedback. Use positive words. So will you versus you have to. Avoid never and always. Avoid following positive feedback with but, because that just kind of destroys the whole thing. You can use and instead to solve that. Don't lecture. Unless you want the other person to shut you out and not listen to you. You want to explore alternatives instead of offering all the answers or solutions. Feedback should never be given to get it off your chest, but only for the value it may have for the recipient. That's very important. And be a good listener. Relaxed shoulders, relaxed open gestures, good eye contact, sitting eye to eye, all that sort of stuff. So as you can see, we'll ask this question in a bit, but this lesson module was really more focused on giving you guys the soft skills to interact not only in aviation, but also hopefully elsewhere in your cadet career and life in general. So hopefully you guys learned some stuff from this, and feel free to ask me any questions. But just as this confirmation question, I'll ask what we went through and talked about for the 5 essential communication skills. So can anyone name some of them? So we talked about inquiry, advocacy and assertion, active listening, conflict resolution, and critique/feedback. All right, so that wraps up this pretty long, heavy lesson. Let me know if you've got any questions for that. This was the last lesson of the night, so we do have another half hour where I can just answer questions in general about the glider pilot training course, the private pilot training course, the application program or process, the National Ground School program, the Air Cadet Flying program in general, Air Cadets in general, cadets in general, your cadet career, life, the universe, and anything. This was the end of the class. It was 408.04, I believe, was the name of the class. Did anyone have any questions from what we talked about? Any thoughts or otherwise? I'm not sure if there will be a study guide. Let me write that down as a question. You will have access to all the PowerPoints. I don't know what the exam is going to look like 100%, but based on my own personal experience of past exams, usually there isn't a lot of content from this class specifically on it. This class is mostly just for your own education and information, as far as I'm aware. I could be wrong. Don't quote me on it, but that's what I'm thinking. I believe the PowerPoints were posted. Let me see if I can find the Teams channel for it. Training resources. So it can sometimes take a moment for it to get posted, but let me post the link in the chat here. There you go. Oh, and then if there's no other questions on the lesson content, let me pause it to you guys, looking for your feedback. What are your thoughts on the lessons that we've had tonight, on their effectiveness, their training aids, any ideas for stuff that we can do to make it more engaging, more educational, easier for you to retain the information from it, thoughts on the content itself, just looking for any and all feedback. Thoughts on my own personal delivering of the content, just looking for your guys' feedback so we can help make it better for future classes. All right, let's do a simple rating system then. So if you think it was all great, you got no comments to say, you can just give a thumbs up. And if you feel like it could have been improved, you can put a surprised reaction. All right. Wait, well, I'll stick around for a few more minutes here then, in case anybody has any other questions. But otherwise, that's all the content for today, so you're free to go. Is the background noise on the mic gone now? Okay, that would have been my desktop fan then. I will note that down. And I won't use it for next time. Any last questions from you, Long?